My name's Fiona Davies. I'm a visual artist from Australia. I have come to the Georgian Silk Museum to do a project called Blood on Silk State Silk Museum, because this museum is one of the oldest silk museums in the world, and it is Georgia is in a very interesting position in the trading routes between the silk trading routes, which is a European concept, and the new trading routes for bioproducts such as blood. Now, the idea of blood and silk being paired together is a bit weird, but it came about because I spent a lot of time with my father when he was in hospital prior to his death. He was in hospital for about 11 and a half months. 4.5 months of that was in intensive care. And in intensive care, which is where you have one nurse to one patient, they have a daily ritual of taking a blood sample. It goes off to be tested, it comes back, the results come back. If the results aren't right, they change the drugs or do something, it goes off again to be tested, it comes back, and this goes on all day. And it becomes a familiar process. It becomes like the choreography of the intensive care ward. After my father died, I did a series of installations about him, or about, not so much him, but about the sort of stories we told each other as a family while he was in hospital. But I located them in places that were important to how he thought about himself. So one was in the first one was in the town both he and my mother grew up in. Then there was in the University of Sydney in the School of Physics, and the final one was in Lincoln College, which was in the University of Oxford, which is where Dad did his PhD. The one that was at the School of Physics in Sydney, when I was doing that installation, they had a small museum in the foyer of the building. So physics is a lot about measuring things. So in the foyer they had a whole range of historical items about observing and measuring things, so telescopes and a whole range of things. So while I was developing that work for there, I became aware of this postdoctoral fellow called Dr. Peter Domachuk, who was working to develop an implantable chip made of silk, or made of the element of silk called fibrion. So silk's made of fibrion and sericin, and it's not a complicated process to pull out the fibrion. It's a beautiful material, it's perfectly transparent, humans aren't allergic to it. You can, by how you dry it, you can drive how disposable it is in your blood. Anyway, so what Peter was attempting to do was to make a chip that could go within your bloodstream, so you have one time of insertion. So it's not like a cannula where you have it in your body for a long time to take blood samples, which is always a point of infection, possible infection. Once the chip's gone in and the wound's healed, that's fine. So the intention was that you could be scanned and your blood characteristics would be read, then the drugs have changed, you're just scanned again. So it's not as invasive, it's not as problematic as taking blood and osteoarthritis, etc. So Peter, another artist called Leanne Hall, who's a writer, and I formed a collaboration of ideas where we basically started talking about the really interesting things that get thrown up when you put silk and blood together. Both silk and blood are really interesting by themselves, and when you put them together, they are amazingly interesting. One of the other issues that came up a lot in our discussions was the idea of surveillance and human rights, and I'm starting to do more and more about how while having a chip in your blood is really good in some aspects, it could also maybe be not so good if, for example, you could be scanned to say, yes, you're fertile, yes, you've got drugs in your system, yes, you're some blood group that somebody doesn't like, whatever. But there are so many things that are so interesting about that overlap of blood and silk. And one of the, coming back to the Georgian Silk Museum for this specific project, I wanted to work with the idea of trade, because Georgia is in a really interesting position trade-wise. When you see the common maps, or the everyday maps of the Silk Route, Georgia doesn't tend to have a really dominant position. It tends to be left out. Like, maps are just a representation of reality and are simplified. And quite often Georgia is simplified out of its position, out of its role. And one of the things I wanted to do was to focus on some of the more interesting, but some of the areas that aren't the normal or everyday focus of an examination of the Silk Route. And the same with the blood trading routes. One of the more common things that is happening in the world that I'm also really interested in is that individuals are looking to how they can monetize themselves, or how they can make money out of themselves. You can sell your blood. If you look up American websites on how to cope with being in a not having enough money, the third thing on the list is always sell your blood. Wow. And it's quite a common way. I mean, the sort of the more extreme ways are sell your kidneys and sell bits of your liver, but it's really a common way that people think that they can make some money is to sell their blood.